There are times when one sees a path ahead, uncertain at best, likely with hidden pitfalls, and yet the only thing to do is move forward and hope for the best. I feel as though this might be one of those times. I hope it isn't, but still. Winter is nearly over, and the first hints of spring have appeared. A bit of new growth here and there, grim skies that promise more rain than snow, and Charlotte once more growing restless. There is a clear emerging pattern in her moods, and it troubles me somewhat. She delights in each and every expedition we undertake into liminal realms. For at least a month or two afterward, she seems quite satisfied with her life, contented and pleasant to be around. Then, slowly, she grows restless and irritable, or falls under a malaise that seems painfully suffocating at times. Oh, she tries to hide it, but still, one can tell with even modest observational skills. Another expedition is the only cure to this affliction, and even the preparations have her suddenly cheerful and excited. I suspect that, deep down, she wants to return to her home. Yet, for reasons too complex to go into here, she cannot safely do so. The tulgey wood she grew up in is now potentially quite dangerous for her. So we cope as best we can by traveling to other liminal spaces. Scrimshaw has been surprisingly helpful in that regard, as he seems to have no lack of travel schemes in mind. Yet this latest venture was not his idea, at least not originally. It began yesterday afternoon with a visit to the country manor Scrimshaw has been exiled to. There's a long story there, and little of it is pleasant. Still, the man has proven himself a decent friend, if a bit troublesome at times, and he is quite hospitable to both Charlotte and myself. Then there's Violet, another long-time resident of liminal space, though her home is quite different from Charlotte's, as is her manor. She has proven herself to be studious and secretive, spending most of her days and nights in Scrimshaw's private library. He is something of a collector of liminal trophies, and this sometimes includes relevant texts and oft disturbing tomes. I suspect she might be searching for something, though I couldn't say exactly what. I don't like to even guess. She has always been civil, even pleasant in her conversation, but there is something subtly off about her. Maybe I'm being unfair. Most likely I am. I hope I am. In any case, yesterday she suggested, or perhaps requested, another liminal venture. Given Charlotte's current state of mind, there was little chance of my refusal. Scrimshaw seemed enthusiastic about the idea as well. The realm she has requested a visit to is officially known as the Eisenreich. It is a strange, rusted desert that is, predictably enough, unusually rich in iron and other metals. The main city, and the only proper city, is called Eisenstadt. Most cities and towns are made of things like wood and stone, with some metal here and there. Eisenstadt is made almost entirely out of metal. It has often been referred to as the Clockwork City, and it is overgrown with various mechanisms. It is said that sophisticated automata walk the streets, though accounts of these are varied and often contradictory. Eisenstadt functions more or less as a sort of trading hub with mundane reality. It is very rich in metal goods, mined from the surrounding desert, but there aren't many other resources. Most plants won't grow in the soil of that realm. Any form of agriculture is more or less a lost cause, and raising animals is out of the question. Even the water often needs to be purified to be suitable for drinking. So it is a city that is extremely wealthy in one sense, and yet is lacking in such basic essentials as food, water, and clothing. This problem is addressed by trade with mundane reality, in particular a sort of sister city just on this side of the gate. This place is known as Stahlheim, and it is an industrial center that relies upon the metals supplied by Eisenstadt. In return, it supplies all of the basic needs the city is otherwise lacking. Apparently, Stahlheim is surrounded by mile upon mile of pastures and farmland to provide these vital goods. After we four had discussed the venture a little while, Scrimshaw took me aside. Charlotte was kind enough to keep Violet busy with pleasant conversation in the meantime. Indeed, there was a conspiratorial look between the two of them that I found just a bit unsettling. The unspoken promise of gossip, I suspect, and I can't help but wonder if Scrimshaw or myself might be among the list of topics. Still, speculation down such avenues is fruitless at best and maddening at worst, so I will instead focus on my own conversation. Like myself, Scrimshaw was a little suspicious of Violet's motives. However, the venture into the Eisenreich still seemed like a good idea for a number of reasons. First off, it was a place Scrimshaw had yet to personally visit. That alone would probably be motivation enough for him, but there are other matters beyond this. Our recent visit to the Amber Desert proved somewhat more costly than expected. Beyond that, my apothecary business has been less than optimal this winter. As the weather was unusually mild this year, many of the medicines I prepared have gone unsold. Granted, this is a good thing for the general populace, but not so good for my own personal expenses. Scrimshaw explained that, given the nature of Eisenstadt, he was confident even my cheapest and most common concoctions would sell remarkably well. More than that, they would likely sell for prices that would be considered criminal almost anywhere else. If we were to trade simple medicines for something like silver or gold, the profit would be considerable. So it seems that we are going to pay a visit to the liminal realm of Eisenreich out of financial necessity as much as anything else. Charlotte seems quite excited about the prospect, and her earlier malaise has evaporated away for the time being. I must admit I am somewhat excited as well. With a little further research, I found curious accounts of strange life out in the desert surrounding Eisenstadt. Metallic creatures wandering among the rocks and sand. A sky that appears to be on fire if you travel deep enough into the desert. My mind returned to certain recent premonitions as I read these curious accounts. This journey feels oddly inescapable, though I'm reluctant to believe in something like fate. I suppose in the end I shall simply need to make the best of things. We set out for Stahlheim within the week. It has been a long journey, but at last we have reached Stahlheim. The air here is thick with soot and smog. There is a constant sound of industry. Hammers fall from 100 unseen locations about us. Forges blaze day and night, heating the air as metal takes on new shapes. It is a sharp contrast to the countless miles of farmland we passed through on our way here. Even traveling by locomotive, and a swift one at that, one could not miss the endless fields. The only forests we passed were oddly regimented. Tree farms, or so I was informed. Lumber is precious on the other side of the gate, and so it is traded along with all the other goods. We're staying the night in some rather humble lodgings, but I've seen far worse in liminal realms. Our travel through the gate has already been arranged, thanks to Scrimshaw's connections. Apparently, we'll be riding along with a handful of other passengers and a large amount of freight. Thankfully, the value and necessity of the inanimate cargo has left the cost to human travelers relatively low. Apparently, there aren't many people who willingly enter the Eisenreich, and there are fewer still that remain for more than a brief visit. Morning has come, and we have arrived at the station. It is a place quite distinct from the station we arrived at when we entered the city yesterday. This place is centrally located within Stahlheim, and it is an order of magnitude larger. Yet for all its size, there is only a single heavily reinforced set of tracks. They lead underground into a carefully sculpted tunnel. There are no shortage of guards here, which has somewhat limited my options for sketching. They don't take all that kindly to somebody recording the layout of the station or the nature of the goods traveling through. Understandable enough, I suppose. Still, there should be no harm in writing down what is patently obvious at least. The train arrived last night, from what I have been told. All through the night, goods have been unloaded and other goods loaded. The engine is a massive thing, threaded through with all sorts of mechanisms. Roughly half of these seem to be entirely inert. I suspect it is designed to function in both mundane reality and liminal space. Such a design must have required an appreciable level of craftsmanship, and probably requires considerable maintenance. The existence of just the single track makes all the more sense in that light. Beyond this, most gates are of such a size that they probably couldn't accommodate much more than a single large locomotive at a time. The call has gone out, and we'll be boarding soon. I shall endeavor to see if I can find a suitable place to capture images from as we travel. We have passed through the gate and into the Eisenreich, and I have the dubious success of finding a perfect spot for capturing images. Apparently, liminal explorers are fairly commonplace here, so certain preparations have been made with our oft-intrepid proclivities in mind. In truth, I think it is as much a practical joke as anything else, but even a cruel jest may still serve. There is a system of handholds built about the main engine, and after signing a small waiver and paying a small fee, it is possible for the brave and the foolish to risk scuttling about on the outside of a train in motion. Thankfully, this locomotive does not move especially swiftly, at least not at the moment. A fit athlete might keep pace at a hard sprint for a few minutes at least. I should touch upon the travel through the gate before I forget. The train set off into the tunnel, its engine sounds echoing loudly within the enclosed space. The air outside was thick with coal smoke, though thankfully the windows were closed. There was the familiar sense of falling sideways in an unknown direction, and the engine grew quiet. We were still in motion for a time, though we were slowing down. Given the lack of worry on other travelers' faces, this was apparently normal. A new sound began to rumble through our surroundings, not the harsh mechanical percussion of a steam engine. Instead, the low, resonant hum of more eldritch mechanisms. We had passed into liminal space, and as such, the other propulsion system was beginning to activate. The air outside the windows cleared, though it was still quite dark. As we began to pick up speed once more, there was a brief announcement over some sort of intercom system. We would be clearing the tunnel within the next 10 minutes or so, and any travelers who wished to venture outside should proceed forward for the necessary paperwork. By the time we exited into the open desert air, I was clinging to the front of the engine like a hapless insect. Terrifying though it was, there was also a certain sense of exhilaration. Charlotte was kind enough to accompany me for safety reasons, as there were no others on board who wished to risk the venture. We settled into place just in time for me to see a large iron wall with a rounded aperture ahead. Another layer of security, perhaps, in case Eisenstadt ever needed to isolate itself. Beyond was a small cluster of buildings, little more than a simple outpost. I didn't see anybody outside, and we passed by without stopping. It was gone almost before I had a proper look. Ahead lay the open desert beneath a strangely clouded sky. We traveled for what felt like nearly half an hour through the open desert, passing deeper and deeper into liminal space. As we did so, the sounds coming from the engine became more resonant, the motion grew more steady, and we were soon traveling at a remarkable speed. Rather terrifying, if I'm being honest. I saw the wisdom of the security ropes and harnesses we had been obliged to put on before stepping out onto the engine exterior. In time, we saw the first glimpses of Eisenstadt in the distance ahead. The city looked rather small at first, until I saw past some of the clouds and fog. Most of what we could see was merely a small extension of the actual city. Having walked the streets a little since our arrival, I can confidently state the place makes its sister city of Stahlheim look like a small village in comparison. There are a few troubling oddities I've already noticed about this realm. Things that seem entirely incongruous with a desert. To begin with, the air here is rather cold. Now this by itself is not so troublesome. Cold deserts are a well-known phenomenon even in mundane reality. The real problem is the moisture. A desert is a desert because it is dry. Thus far, this place has not been at all dry. Clouds are abundant overhead, and the streets have been quite damp in a number of places. There was a very slight rainfall even as we left the train. Hardly noticeable, but very much out of place within a supposed desert. All of this precipitation did not seem at all unusual to the residents, so I must assume it is at least reasonably commonplace here. Beyond the obvious absurdity of a desert with rainfall, there is another pressing issue connected to the phenomenon. Afternoon has faded towards evening, and we've wandered through the city in search of lodgings for the night. During these wanderings, there was a proper rainstorm, sufficient to leave puddles in the streets. Once again, no reaction from the populace, beyond a few grumblings at the minor inconvenience. Such rainfall is definitely commonplace here, at this time of year at the very least. So here is the other significant problem. Eisenstadt is most certainly a city of metal. Just about every structure appears to be made of iron, steel, brass, and other such materials. Stahlheim was much the same at its heart, but there were signs of corrosion in that city that are absent here. Now, if this was a suitably dry desert, I might allow for a relative lack of rust given the lack of water, especially if the local soil was lacking in salt. However, if rain is this commonplace, then the city should be quite thoroughly corroded by this point. Yet this is not the case. Oh, there is a degree of corrosion here and there, but it is far less extensive than it should be. Many of the metal surfaces on the buildings are pristine, surfaces that should be well out of reach for regular polishing maintenance. We've managed to find simple quarters for the night, fairly small and relatively humble, but quite high up with a spectacular view of the sunset outside. We four have spoken together about a few things, making plans for tomorrow and the like. I've brought up my observations, and we are all more or less agreed upon the matter. The first great pair of mysteries of the Eisenreich are as follows. First, what kind of desert has regular rainfall? Second, what sort of metal fails to rust after what must be decades of exposure to the elements? I suspect the answers might be had easily enough on the morrow if we can find the right people to speak with. It is morning now, and the city looks positively pristine in the early light. Our little band of four has decided to stay together for the time being. It is a large city, and none of us knows its layout all that well, so honestly, we could probably use all the help we can get, even if that help is from each other. Scrimshaw's predictions about possible demand for my simple medicines have, if anything, fallen short. I was able to secure our lodgings for the night with just a couple of small vials of simple expectorant. Antitussives have sold quite well thus far today, securing a decent meal, a semi-usable map of the district, and transportation in one of the local cabs. More than that, it's left most people open and talkative, and that has been quite useful thus far. In fact, for a small vial of analgesic, maybe 7 doses worth, we've managed to hire something of a temporary guide for the afternoon. The same fellow driving the cab. He did stipulate that we would not be capturing any images of him or his transport device, which is reasonable enough, I suppose. As we moved through the lower levels of the city, we found ourselves half engulfed in a bank of morning fog, accumulated steam from some of the local refining processes, or so we were told. Water is often purified by distillation to remove metal impurities, and a bit of escaping steam is an unavoidable side effect of this process when it's conducted on such a grand scale. Charlotte noticed a number of automata working in this region, apparently conducting minor repairs and maintenance on some of the larger building structures. Some of these strange creatures had roughly human shapes, while others seemed more like arthropods. Our guide noticed our interest and diverted us to a small building wedged in among the larger structures. Inside, we were shown something approximating a cross between a workshop and an antique shop. The owner was working on a smaller automaton, which looked like a sort of patchwork iron crab. Charlotte began a conversation and was soon getting a semi-formal lecture about robotics. After a minute or two, Violet politely interjected. She delicately inquired as to the power sources for these automata and the city in general. The simple answer was fire orbs. When all four of us gave a series of blank looks, the shop owner couldn't help but chuckle. He moved towards the back of the room and gestured for us to follow. We were led through a narrow hallway into a more secluded, private sort of space. It was still a workshop, and there was still a surprising amount of wood within the structure. He explained in passing that this was a very old family shop, and it had taken a couple of generations to line the interior spaces with suitable lumber. Apparently it is a sign of luxury, or perhaps tradition and respectability, within this city of metal. Such passing explanations nearly fell on deaf ears, though, as our attention was largely focused upon a luminous device near the center of this back room. It didn't give off nearly as much light as the nearby lanterns, and it seemed quite dubious that it was there for illumination. Moving closer, we saw it was a large transparent orb filled with an endlessly roiling maelstrom of fire. The effect was almost hypnotic, and quite beautiful in its way. Drawing nearer still, we noticed no sense of heat emanating from the device. It was explained that the material that looked like clear glass was in fact something else, something with remarkable thermal insulation that contained this strange, self-sustaining blaze. Obviously, any natural flame would have suffocated itself rather quickly in such a confined space. So even if this looked like fire, it had to be something different. When we asked just what it was, though, answers were surprisingly murky. We learned that fire orbs were harvested in the deep desert and installed throughout the city as power sources. They were nearly unbreakable, apparently, and specific forms of metal connection were able to supply energy for heat, light, or motion. In fact, the lanterns in the room were being supplied by this fire orb. Our guide, who had followed us to the back of the shop, asked if we would like to see another example of such an orb. I suspect he did this to keep us from imposing too much more on his aged friend. After following him back to the street, we watched as he lifted a panel on the back of his cab, revealing a small glass orb in the midst of a tangle of metalwork. It sat there like a jewel, filled with living flame, a power supply sufficient to propel a vehicle through the city with relative ease. After this brief glimpse into the heart of our mode of transportation, he asked where we might like to travel to next. Scrimshaw readily answered, somewhere a bit more uptown, preferably any respectable establishment where he thought my medicines could sell for good prices. With that, we were off once more, hurtling through the clockwork streets. As it turns out, in Eisenstadt, uptown is literally up. Apparently, the small accommodations we had last night were more upscale than we had realized. Our guide brought us to an open space some distance above the ground, a sort of open plaza leading into all sorts of workshops and cafes and the like. All open air, all fairly upscale. The people here were dressed with noticeable style, and they didn't look too kindly on our guide when they looked at him at all. This was not his favorite environment, and it was clear that he didn't want to linger. So, as graciously as possible, Scrimshaw thanked him for his service to us and said we'd manage from this point. I sent him off with an extra vial of medicine, a simple antipyretic, and he seemed quite pleased as he hurried back to the more comfortable depths of the city. It didn't take long for both Scrimshaw and Violet to start pleasant conversations with some of the passers-by. Soon enough, even Charlotte and myself were drawing limited interest. People asking about what medicines I had to hand, though more than a few were asking quietly if I had anything more exciting than simple medication. I wasn't sure whether to be amused or mortified, so I settled on polite as best I could. Looking out at our lofty surroundings, I noticed a number of glass enclosures on the rooftops. Many had hints of greenery inside. So, after one of the more awkward inquiries, I asked about these greenhouses. It was explained that many of the more well-heeled in the city kept private greenhouses for growing local produce. It was something of a luxury and a popular pastime for many of the upper class. At this point, another individual approached with a troubled look. She seemed to be something like a maid or a butler, perhaps. After a courteous bow to the individual I was speaking with, she asked me if I had any experience growing plants. In fact, I had tended a number of indoor herb gardens back home, so I answered more or less in the affirmative. Almost before I realized what was happening, both myself and my companions were being hurried over to a fairly large, opulent cab nearby. We were soon traveling at frightening speeds along a system of narrow metal roadways supported and suspended quite some distance above the ground. Our driver explained that her employer had been having some considerable difficulty with one of their greenhouses. Several horticultural experts had been consulted, but answers were not forthcoming. Thus, she had seized upon the presence of even an amateur botanist like myself, as I was not familiar with the city. There was the hope that my outside perspective might uncover the issue that had thus far stymied the local experts. Morning has turned to afternoon, and I've spent the last couple of hours touring through several greenhouses. It's been something of a crash course in local systems and customs before meeting with a very frustrated gentleman in one of the larger enclosures. He explained that a single greenhouse was defying all sense and expectation. Normally, the plants there were meant to produce fruits somewhat akin to plums or apples. However, there hadn't been so much as a single flower in several months now. Thus far, there was no sign of any fungal blight or insect infestation. In fact, after all of the extra care, the plants seemed remarkably healthy. The poor fellow seemed genuinely earnest, and I couldn't help but take an interest in this little mystery in any case. As we walked through this particular greenhouse, I asked what he could tell me of the plants themselves, where they came from, what lands they were native to, when they normally flowered. I had a suspicion of what might be wrong, but it would take a little bit of looking into. I asked about the evening security arrangements, suggesting that maybe something untoward could be happening at night. He explained that, like most greenhouses in the city, his enclosures were protected by metal shutters at night. Access was granted only to a couple of night watchmen. I asked that they be brought if at all possible, just so I could ask them directly about any oddities at night. Soon enough, I was in the company of an elderly chap with a sharp smile and calloused hands. It was briefly explained that he was the watchman for this particular greenhouse, as well as a few dozen others and a sizable portion of the rest of the estate. He asked if there might be any trouble amiss. In answer, I requested a few minutes to speak alone, explaining that answers might be more readily forthcoming without his employer closely watching the conversation. As soon as the nobleman left, for 5 minutes, so he said, I immediately got to the point. In truth, I had only a couple of simple questions for the fellow. First, I asked if he entered the greenhouses normally at night. He explained that he did a thorough search before shutters closed each night and after they opened each morning. In the intervening time, he mostly just checked that the shutters were in place from outside. My second question, very pointedly, was whether he did anything different with this particular greenhouse. After a bit of hesitation, he explained that this greenhouse had always been his favorite, and so he would often take his late-watch meal here. This was with permission from the owner, and it had been encouraged since the trouble had started. Likely there was a hope to catch some manner of nocturnal miscreant. I couldn't help but smile. When the nobleman returned, I declared that I had most likely solved the mystery. He seemed skeptical about this assertion, but gestured for me to continue. We walked through one of the larger, more impressive greenhouses as I endeavored to explain. In many varieties of plant, particularly those known for flowering early in the spring, there is a most interesting phenomenon. These plants require a prolonged period of darkness every 24 hours in order to flower. They are sometimes described as short-day plants for that reason. During the watchman's nightly visits to that one greenhouse, he'd had lights on while he took his break and his midnight meal. This bit of light in the middle of the otherwise dark night had been enough to prevent any flowers and any of the fruits that would have followed. Thankfully, the employer wasn't at all displeased with his watchman. As he had gained express permission and aided in many of the frustrated efforts in that greenhouse, one couldn't really think ill of him. As we spoke, one of the nearby attendants had rushed off before returning with an armful of books. Horticultural treatises, the nobleman explained. After looking through a couple of these tomes, he let out an almost joyful exclamation. My assertions regarding short-day plants had been verified quite plainly in the fine print. To say he was pleased with our group of travelers would be something of an understatement. He asked plainly what we would like in return for untangling this problem of his. Scrimshaw stepped in, explaining that we were liminal explorers, and as such we had an interest in seeing the deeper desert. So any insights or aid he might offer to facilitate such a venture would be most appreciated. In answer, he said that we four would be quartered in some of his spare lodgings for the night, provided with an evening and morning meal, and given a writ of passage allowing free travel to any of the outposts. The conditions were simple enough. No images of the quarters or the staff, or him for that matter. I could keep what I'd captured of the greenhouses at least. We were also requested to pass by this place again on our way home, so he could ask what we had seen out in the desert. A most agreeable arrangement in the end. Indeed, I almost felt as though we were taking undue advantage, and offered a few vials of medicine in return for such generosity. It was politely explained that he had a resident apothecary to grow and formulate all his medications personally, though the gesture was appreciated. With that, there was little else to do but settle in for the night and prepare for travel on the morrow. Our second morning in Eisenstadt, and it's a little more rainy than yesterday. After taking some time to make ourselves presentable, we met with the owner of the house over an unusual morning meal. The setting, the table, the plates, the utensils, all very luxurious. Ornately crafted metalwork, gold plating everywhere, rich lacquered wood in a number of places, even a few charming paintings. Yet for all this luxury, the food itself was relatively plain, almost bland. Even so, it was presented as if it was quite high quality. Compared to other meals in this realm, I suppose it was. Just another odd little quirk of a realm where precious metals are cheap and basic necessities are precious. Then again, such necessities are always precious. Their local scarcity has served as a poignant reminder of this. When we were almost finished with the food, a number of maps were brought out. Between them, we began to get a fairly good sense of this realm. Eisenstadt acts as a central hub between a few dozen smaller settlements. Each of these is essentially a mining outpost, for lack of a better term, and it is connected to both Eisenstadt and nearby outposts by a series of railroads. Most of these mines are located at the edge of what is described as the Deep Desert. Each of these has several connections leading to much smaller outposts on an otherwise empty map. Some of these connections are railroads, but many are simple pathways. The most isolated outposts lack even these basic connections, appearing as isolated spots at the edge of the map. Our host was kind enough to direct us to one of the major outposts in particular, a place labeled as Orson's Crown, an odd name aggrandizing the founder of the place some 200 years ago. It is of reasonably large size, and perhaps more significantly, it has one of the most extensive networks connecting it to the deepest portions of the desert on the map. After furnishing us with a few newly drafted identification papers stamped with the seal of his house, our host sent us on our way. It took a little bit of navigating before we found our way to the proper train station, where we four are now waiting with a sense of anticipation. Violet in particular seems more animated than I think I've ever seen her. Whatever she expects to find in this desert, it must be an especially exciting idea. When the train arrived, it was more impressive than I'd anticipated, no doubt a sign of just how much freight moves between the city and its surrounding outposts. As with the other train, we were permitted to secure ourselves to the outside of the engine with a bit of paperwork and another small fee. As before, only Charlotte and myself took advantage of this opportunity. However, we didn't step outside immediately. As the train began to move, we found ourselves chatting amicably with one of the local mine workers, apparently returning from some business within the city. He was kind enough to answer a few questions that had been lingering on our minds as the minutes passed. When I asked why the Eisenreich was a desert, despite seemingly abundant rainfall, he supplied a bit of information that seemed rather obvious in retrospect. The ground here is rich in all sorts of metal, including a number of more toxic compounds like lead and arsenic. As a result, almost nothing can grow in this soil. Thus, no matter how much rain might fall, the realm remains a largely barren desert. Really, a wasteland might be a better term for it in this case. In time, we ventured carefully out onto the engine. The speed was thankfully a good deal lower than the other train we'd recently been on. Still, it was fast enough to leave the two of us fairly cold and more than a little damp with the light rainfall. Despite this, I think it was worthwhile to get our first glimpse of the mining outpost. It rose up from the desert before us like a dark crown of jagged towers. I couldn't help but have a lingering sense of foreboding as we pushed further into the increasingly strange desert. When we reached the outpost, it wasn't at all what I had expected. The train stopped in a narrow expanse of open space. To one side, the dark towers rose silhouetted against the sky. To the other, there was a vast, shallow pit filled with somewhat different towers. These were more sturdy and less angular, almost bulbous in places. There was a constant drone of machinery coming from these lower structures. A bit of quick inquiry revealed that the high angular towers were residences and administrative centers. The actual mining operations were in the pit. There was little question which direction we would travel in first. As tantalizing as the pit might have been, we would likely need some sort of authorization before being allowed to visit. Even so, we lingered a while to look down at these strange mining centers. Scrimshaw pointed something out that was quite unusual. There were no automata visible around these structures. Nothing breaking rocks, nothing carrying loads, nothing excavating mining tunnels. However, there were a number of people scattered about the area, moving in small groups. Many of these were carrying bags, and a few even had fairly large vehicles. Scrimshaw took out a small spyglass, and he looked at it a little while before handing it to me. What I saw was quite unusual. Focusing on one of the groups nearest to a tower cluster, I took in the sight of the strangers. They were robed and hooded with what looked like leather gloves. This particular group was gathered around a large vehicle that consisted of a small cab and a large basket. The people were lifting things out of this basket to be received by others at a nearby entrance. These things were clearly metallic, but oddly shaped. They appeared almost biological rather than mechanical. I recalled the accounts I had read about odd metallic creatures in the desert and found myself wondering why they would be brought here. As it turned out, the administrative towers were off limits for the most part, but we were able to find lodging on one of the lower levels, just as well as daylight was fading. I managed a few good trades with the medicine, securing a decent meal and a few favors for tomorrow. We would be able to see inside the mining towers with a proper escort. In the meantime, we passed the time conversing with some of the local staff for the facility. There were commons areas that looked more like expansive workshops than anything else. Several people were resting, eating simple meals, and generally conversing together. One in particular, a pleasant young lady who asked pointedly to remain anonymous, developed quite the rapport with Charlotte and Violet. Meanwhile, Scrimshaw and myself ended up speaking with an older gentleman. We risked asking about the odd metal things we'd seen outside, and this provoked a warm chuckle by the old man. He said it was understandable that we might misinterpret what people around here meant by mining. As we followed him into a quieter corner of the commons area, he explained the nature of mining in the Eisenreich. There had been a time, at least 100 years ago now, when people tried the conventional methods of digging ore out of the ground. It had been quite profitable, as metals are almost absurdly abundant in every bit of rock and soil here. However, as time passed, a more efficient mining method slowly began to take over. Rather than expending considerable energy refining ore to metal, people began hunting down the metal creatures in the deep desert. As it turned out, it was a good deal easier to simply butcher them after a fashion, dissecting their bodies down to different metallic components and melting these scraps into purified ingots. The entire process was apparently rather complicated, but less dangerous than mining, and there was an additional benefit. Each of these creatures had a fire orb at its heart. In fact, every orb we'd seen in Eisenstadt had originally been harvested from some manner of metal monster hunted in the deep desert. The implications of this were rather overwhelming. We inquired where we might learn more about the details of this odd process, and we were informed that a number of old technical diagrams could be retrieved. However, the hour was growing late by that time, so we were promised a look at these in the morning. Well, this is all a bit unexpected. Scrimshaw here, writing in the stead of my esteemed colleague once again, who has requested that I handle the journal entries for a little while. Not sure how long, not sure it matters. Hopefully it doesn't matter all that much. One might ask why Herbert asked me to do this. I should mention as an aside, I only call him Herbert here as something of an ongoing jest. That is not his proper name, and it is not his traveling name, but he prefers anonymity in these records. So the anonymous Herbert has made this request of me because he's managed to leave himself almost cross-eyed with all the reading of late. Spent almost the entire day sifting through various records and documents. I think anyone could appreciate why he might not care for the sight of pen or paper for at least a time. In any case, I suppose it would be best to pick up where he left off. Morning came to the Eisenreich and found us in a mining outpost known as Orson's Crown. Bit of a fanciful name, but that seems to be all too common in liminal places. Something about them tends to make one go all whimsical around the edges. With a bit of careful talk and general good manners, we were able to secure a visit to the proper mining towers in the settlement. Inside, though, it didn't seem all that much like any mining operation I'm familiar with. It looked more like a factory floor, though apparently the place is laid out for taking things apart rather than putting them together. The foreman, who was kind enough to take on a temporary role as our guide, led us along the periphery of one of the larger chambers. We went through several locked doors and several cramped, winding hallways between them. At the end of all this was something like an archive. The foreman told us the room was mostly used for storing older, more outdated records. We were given the run of the place, provided we didn't damage anything or steal anything away. Thankfully, the photoeidetic devices we brought along would do for copying anything we found particularly interesting. He left us to our devices, and the three of us gathered around Herbert to bring him whatever we could find. Most of it was old ledgers and useless trivia, but we did manage to uncover a few relevant documents. Apparently, one of the more common forms of metallic life in this desert resembles something like a silverfish, or maybe a woodlouse. Probably something in between. According to Herbert, this makes a certain amount of sense. Arthropods are found all over in mundane reality, and the design does seem to work pretty well for getting around. Of course, arthropods back home tend to be a good deal smaller. Some of the schematics we copied suggest creatures several meters long wandering out in the deeper parts of the desert. Thankfully, they seem fairly docile, going by all accounts. They didn't even appear to resist when hunters would disassemble them, though I wonder if the writers might have been skewing their accounts just a little. The really interesting things we happened across were a few anatomical diagrams. These beasties have internal organs, as one might expect from any animal, but the layouts were a bit different. There are digestive chambers that seem built for processing ore into metal, and a number of cog and lever systems allowing for locomotion. No respiratory systems, though, and no hint of any reproductive organs. Stranger still, the digestive system has a front entrance, but no back exit. The creatures presumably gather up ore and vomit up refined metals. There is something like a combination nervous system and circulatory system, with a fire orb serving the role of both heart and brain. This system connects to all of the other structures, providing both energy and direction. We were also able to find a few notes on the composition of these various organs. The outer armor plates were mostly iron. Cutting mouthparts incorporated titanium and tungsten alloys. Internal cogs were largely made of a hardened form of steel. The nervous system, such as it was, incorporated large amounts of silver and gold as well as copper. Most unusual was the indication of an unknown substance in several of the alloy descriptions. Something only described as shine that tended to make up anywhere from 1 to 10% of every bit of the creature. It seemed to be most common in the nervous system and nearly absent in the external plating. Beyond the technical manuals, we also found a number of old visual records, photoeidetic captures of a handful of odd forms out in the desert. I suspect these were meant to be examples of more anomalous finds, or at least rarer creatures, but it's difficult to tell without spending more time researching. I am not sure what the normal creatures in the desert are supposed to look like, not sure if there is anything we would consider normal anyway. Looking through these images, though, I can't help but think it's more than a little strange. Apparently, these are very old images from several decades back, images of creatures no longer seen in the desert. Some of the more obtuse individuals seem to think that these forms were hunted to extinction. That might work in a more conventional ecosystem, but there's a problem with that theory here. So far as we can tell, every one of these beasties originates from the deepest parts of the desert beyond the threshold of human habitation. So it wouldn't be possible to hunt them to extinction when all they need to do to escape is stay where they were born, or made, and where they are likely better adapted to survive anyway. Yet these forms are no longer seen by all accounts. According to Herbert, some of them bear a resemblance to certain echinoderms, creatures that specialize in sweeping up food from the ocean floor, straining it out of sediment. I suppose the comparison is apt, as these creatures were documented to wander aimlessly about the desert, eating dirt to extract the metal content. One of the most recent images in this set shows something a bit more mobile. The thing looks like a spider, or maybe a giant tick. That is a thought I didn't need. Anyway, the accompanying notes describe this as a likely precursor to the more modern forms of these creatures. This suggests a worrying pattern. In nature, it is said that evolutionary adaptation takes multiple generations, generally centuries at least, for even the fastest life cycles. However, it seems that similar adaptation and alteration have taken place here within mere decades. Millions of years of evolutionary advancement in decades. We're all a bit concerned about this. Well, actually, 3 of us are concerned. Violet seems positively excited. If anything, that makes me even more concerned. We're traveling again, deeper into the desert. The air tastes strange here. There's something about deeper liminal realms that always sets my teeth on edge. It's like I can feel reality fraying at the edges, or maybe breaking down altogether. The train we're on is a good deal smaller and more humble than the others we've boarded in recent days. This one is little more than a cargo hauler, and we've been given an empty corner surrounded by supply crates. That said, there's still that odd custom of external viewing for a price. Our usual pair of daredevils are out there even now, and this time Violet has joined them. Gives me a bit of time to myself looking at all the metal boxes around me. I had considered capturing an image or two, but honestly it's dismal and boring inside here. I'm sure whatever images the others are taking outside will be far more worthwhile. The outpost we're heading to is a place known as Port Nowhere, an inside joke as the settlement borders on a large salt flat. Apparently it looks reminiscent of a lake in certain conditions. I suspect intoxication might be one of these conditions. Despite the foreboding name, it is one of the largest outer settlements in the region. This is because it is the primary gateway to the deepest parts of the desert where most of the metallic creatures are hunted down. Thus, it is a massive hub for materials. Probably the only thing keeping the place alive considering how remote it is. The sun has set and we've settled into our accommodations for the night. Herbert has spent most of his time either sifting through the information he's gathered or napping. Poor fellow seems exhausted, honestly. Glad he has Charlotte keeping an eye on him. Our rooms here are better than I would have expected, but honestly I should have probably expected better. As much material as passes through here, there are a lot of people deeply interested in this place. So, isolated or not, it's surprisingly well furnished. I'll take what comfort I can get. We've done a very small amount of planning since our arrival, and so far there is only one major point we're all agreed upon. None of us is familiar with these lands. Thus, if we want to travel out any further, we will need a guide. Thankfully, this is the perfect place to look for one. For now, I suppose the most important thing is to get some proper rest. A good night's rest does make a world of difference sometimes. After reviewing Scrimshaw's entries from yesterday, I'm not sure what to think. On the one hand, he's not missing any vital details. On the other hand, I do wonder about his running commentary. Then again, I suppose I do the same thing from time to time. As he noted, our unanimous decision for today was to seek out a guide. This proved to be a bit easier than I had anticipated. Charlotte has served as a guide for a number of years in her homeland, and as such, she has a bit of an eye for similar people. As we were taking a morning meal in a sort of commons area, she began conversing with a solitary young woman at a nearby table. The young lady was swiftly invited to our own table and introduced herself as Abigail Bernstein, or Abby for short. She and Charlotte had quite the rapport in short order, and it turned out this young lady was a guide. She certainly looked the part, especially outside with her hood up and her goggles down. Still a bit of a novice by her own estimation, but she's grown up in this settlement and claims to have learned from the best. I suppose we'll find out, as Charlotte has taken a liking to her. If nothing else, she is willing to work for a reasonable price. Everybody else we tried approaching was asking for fairly ridiculous sums. Apparently it's a thriving business in this town, with wealthy types wanting a bit of adventure in the deep desert. Our claims to be something a bit more serious have been politely humored by Abby thus far. As soon as we gather up a few supplies, we'll be leaving for parts unknown, or at least unknown to us. One day's travel into the deep desert and it feels like a different world altogether. The night sky here is remarkable, at least in one particular direction. It is as if the sky itself is on fire, which may not be too far from the truth. Daylight was bright enough to obscure this phenomenon, then as the sun set, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I should briefly explain recent events first. As these events have unfolded, it might be more accurate to say we have had a night's travel rather than a day's travel. When we gathered our supplies and met at the edge of the settlement, Abby was waiting for us. She stated that she would be willing to take us out into the desert at that time, but suggested that it would be far easier to travel by night. If we were agreeable, we could travel a short distance from the settlement before stopping for a rest and sleeping if at all possible. Then we would resume travel at sundown. We agreed to this unusual plan, though not without a degree of suspicion. Abby led us to a secluded location without incident and briefly explained her reasoning to us. Staying in the outpost until sundown would likely mean paying for accommodations, which didn't come cheap in such a place. Beyond that, evening departures would be a good time for an ambush at the settlement's edges. The odds weren't too high, but this is a relatively lawless place. As the sun set, we saw the reason why traveling at night would likely be easier. In one direction in particular, the sky was illuminated by what looked like a constantly shifting, roiling mass of fiery clouds. That was the threshold, so we were told. The deepest part of the desert lay in that direction, and its constant illumination at night made navigation much easier. This was all the more important as conventional compasses become very unreliable this far into the realm. Too many metal deposits, some of which have significant magnetic properties. So, with this rather spectacular answer to a North Star to navigate by, we traveled onward into the deep Eisenreich. It would seem that the deeper desert has a number of hidden surprises. It's our second night of travel, and we've passed by a number of metallic creatures, mostly at a distance. They were interesting enough in their own right, but ironically, it was a more familiar sight that proved most interesting to me. Plants. Gnarled, withered alien plants, but genuine organic plant life nonetheless. A number of low clumps of yellowed grass, other small shrubs, and the occasional stunted tree. The vegetation was oddly twisted, seeming almost tortured, but this seemed to give it a poignant sort of beauty. Or maybe I'm just romanticizing things. Abby was kind enough to provide a somewhat more scientific analysis. She explained that the soil here was relatively low in metal content, allowing such plants to grow. They served as indicators of safer ground to travel, as especially toxic substances like lead and mercury would be absent here, or very nearly so. Beyond this, a region of low metal content was less likely to be frequented by the local metallic life forms. Not much for them to consume, after all. That said, there was still an appreciable amount of metal contaminating the soil, and these plants had adapted accordingly. A closer inspection showed a number of small metallic flakes clinging to the tree bark, apparently secreted by specialized epidermal glands and thin and lightweight enough to be blown away elsewhere by even a modest breeze. As dawn broke, we set up camp near a relatively large, presumably ancient tree. In truth, it was no more than twice our height, but this made it the largest plant I'd seen in these regions. Even the carefully tended fruit trees in the Eisenstadt greenhouses didn't often reach this size. I noted the lack of leaves, despite the presence of large pale flowers on many of the trees. Abby explained that this was simply the season for flowering, and I recalled that it was in fact springtime back home as well. The leaves would emerge in another month or two when the flowers faded. When I asked what might pollinate such blossoms, Abby was oddly at a loss. She had never seen any flying creatures in the desert, yet such prominent flowers strongly suggested some manner of creature to visit them. Another mystery, I suppose. This desert feels more and more unearthly as we travel further into its depths. This past night we encountered something almost indescribable. A behemoth of metal wearing a shape reminiscent of several creatures, but conforming to none. The thing moved with a slow, steady gait, siphoning up sand and stones. It seemed like something between a living creature and a mobile mining platform. If it noticed us, it gave no indication. Instead, it simply moved along on its way like something out of a fractured dream. This place feels wrong, like a place people are not meant to be in. Not an unfamiliar feeling. I have felt it often whenever I was near to a liminal midpoint, that subtle threshold where our rules of reality slip away in favor of whatever rules the adjoining reality might have. That boundary is a little ways off yet, but closer than I'd like. For some reason, the other reality seems especially inhospitable in this case. It seems that we have arrived at the last outpost on the edge of the world, or rather an isolated outpost that is quite close to the boundary where our reality is subsumed. It stands like a lonely tower, almost skeletal in its appearance, more scaffold than structure. According to our guide, it was originally meant as the beginning of a rather ambitious settlement, but complications arose. It isn't healthy for people to linger outdoors this far into the desert. Apparently, there are regular storms of fairly harmful radiation. This made us move all the faster towards this singular shelter. As we came closer, I could see sturdy walls in place beneath the scaffolding, an improvised structure of sorts. Lesser than the initial plan, but made especially secure against the elements. When Scrimshaw asked what sort of people might stay in a place like this, Abby explained that only 2 people currently called this place home. One was a solitary researcher drawn to subjects that most regarded as esoteric at best. The other was essentially a self-appointed guard. We were assured that this would make more sense when we met them. Abby further explained that something about our demeanor had suggested we might benefit from a bit of conversation with this researcher. Violet in particular seemed quite interested in such a meeting, though she did her best to conceal this beneath an expression of forced calm. I will admit I was rather curious myself. So our small band of 5 entered this lonely tower, this furthest outpost in a desert of metal and fire. This outpost, this tower at the edge of nowhere, it has not been what I expected. The place holds facilities enough for maybe a dozen inhabitants, double that if space is used with ruthless efficiency. However, there are only 2 permanent occupants, the only people present when Abby led our little group to the front door. We were greeted by a rather large gentleman with a dour expression, at least until he saw our guide. That brought a smile of recognition, and he welcomed our group inside the structure. A few quick words with Abby, and we were shown to temporary quarters. We were all rather tired from traveling, and none of us were in any condition to hold anything resembling a serious conversation. There was nothing for it but to rest at least a little while. Whether for good or for ill, I was the first of our group to awaken. I half stumbled my way through the quiet rooms and corridors until I found the 2 inhabitants conversing quietly in a sort of workshop. A few pleasantries were exchanged, and I offered to show what medicines I still had after several days of bartering such things away. This led to a fairly amicable conversation where I became more or less acquainted with this pair of unlikely hosts. The large fellow that had met us at the door went by the name of Grim. Apparently he was a miner, or perhaps hunter would be more accurate. He described himself as semi-retired, though he still made frequent forays into the deep desert and seemed quite proud of images he had captured while there. Still, according to him at least, his primary duty was looking after the outpost and its other inhabitant. The young lady beside him went by the name of Aura, though I'm sure this name was also a pseudonym. Apparently she is something of a freelance researcher. My keen grasp of the obvious made it fairly clear that these 2 are more than mere associates. Quite a bit more, judging by how they look at one another. Still, it would be impolite to dwell further on this particular matter. In time, the rest of our band of 5 woke up and found their way into the workshop and the conversation. As it happened, both Scrimshaw and Charlotte seemed to hit it off with Grim rather well. They began swapping tales of past adventures, and soon enough Grim was leading the both of them away to show off his collection of images taken from the deep desert. This left Violet, Abby, and myself speaking with Aura in the meantime. It seems I'm making another unexpected entry at Herbert's request. Yes, this is the indefatigable Scrimshaw reporting once more with tales of the truly odd. This particular entry is basically a review of a photo album for all intents and purposes. Still, it is quite the album. That Grim fellow has a knack for photography, or whatever they call the applied use of a photoeidetic device. He showed us dozens of images, all the while explaining what things are like in the furthest reaches of the Eisenreich. As one draws near to the threshold, sometimes termed the liminal midpoint by more scholarly types, the entire sky appears to be on fire. This is not merely for show. The temperatures tend to be subtly higher, but that is not the primary concern. The main issue is the dangerous levels of radiation. Nobody travels this deep without a protective suit of armor. I had a look at the suits both Grim and Aura employ on their ventures, but I was asked not to capture any images. They are apparently custom-built with a number of trade secrets and proprietary features that are quite unique. As a guest, what could I do but oblige? As if to make up for this restriction, I was permitted, and even encouraged, to make copies of a few of the more memorable images Grim has captured. They are like something out of a fever dream. Great monstrous beasts of living metal in a realm of stone and fire. Lumbering arthropods in most cases, but a couple of images depict creatures nearer to mythical dragons than anything else. When I asked about their temperament, Grim answered that was the strangest part. For all the ferocity of their appearances, they were invariably docile creatures, or at least not particularly aggressive. Both he and his companion were able to venture quite close to them without any apparent danger. All very puzzling, or so I thought at least. He seemed rather amused at this puzzlement, and I suppose I couldn't blame him. While some of our number were off looking at images, the rest of us ended up on a limited tour of the facility. Aura brought us to one of her laboratories, and I couldn't help but notice the rather prominent fire orb in the heart of the room. A mere power source, so she assured me, but I wonder. There were a number of unfamiliar devices connected to the orb that I hadn't seen in other settings. Still, pressing the matter wouldn't lead to anything productive, so I endeavored to speak on other matters. I asked politely about her research, and she did admit that the fire orbs featured prominently in her recent investigations. With that in mind, I admitted to a degree of ignorance about these orbs in general and expressed an interest in learning more about them. She seemed quite happy to oblige. I should note that Violet was listening very attentively as well. All the while, I couldn't help but notice a certain evasiveness around the edges of some topics and lines of inquiry. At the same time, it is clear enough that this facility holds far more laboratory space than what we have seen thus far. I believe that Abby knows more than she is letting on, but I am at a loss as to any further details, at least for the moment. It is several hours now since my last entry, and I have gained a few interesting insights in that time. Information that is not commonly shared with outsiders, at least back in Eisenstadt. It has to do with the nature of the metals found in this desert, or rather an unexpected component. It began when I asked Aura about some of the more cryptic alloy descriptions I'd seen in the old mining records, oblique references to something most commonly known as shine when it was named at all. This gave her pause, and I could see the concern in her expression as she looked over to Abby. Thankfully, our guide was quite helpful, offering a small nod of encouragement for Aura to speak freely. Thus emboldened, she began to explain a rather singular substance found only within the Eisenreich. We were led into another laboratory and shown a couple of flasks filled with an unusual liquid. It looked like mercury, which was rather concerning, but I was assured it was something else altogether. The substance is most often referred to as shine silver, and it is a ubiquitous component of the metallic creatures that wander the desert. It is also apparently necessary for energy transduction and transmission from fire orbs. I asked Aura to clarify this, and she explained that a fire orb connected to any metal without shine silver remains functionally inert. No energy is transferred, and no power is harnessed. However, when connected to virtually any metal that has been alloyed with even a small amount of shine silver, the energy transmission becomes remarkably easy, with virtually no resistance or accompanying heat generation. The implication of this was clear enough. The whole of Eisenstadt is alloyed with this odd substance. Not exactly a comforting thought given potential toxicity. In answer to these concerns, Aura took a small earthen bowl and poured a bit of shine silver into it, then asked me to hold a hand over the stuff. Much to my surprise, it withdrew from my hand, forming a faint depression in the gleaming surface. Even after I withdrew my arm, the stuff still rippled uneasily for a long while. Aura explained that shine silver actively avoids organic matter, and as such cannot function as a toxin to our physiology. It even repels water and resists oxidation, neatly explaining the relative lack of rust and corrosion in the structures of this realm. No doubt she meant this to be reassuring, but it is at the same time rather concerning. Violet was extraordinarily interested in all of this, I should note. She was the one who asked why the bowl was earthenware rather than metal. Aura explained that any direct contact with metal would lead to the shine silver soaking into the stuff, actively alloying itself apparently without any need for human intervention. This was even more worrisome, though I think I managed to conceal most of my unease at the time. It has been a most illuminating visit thus far, though I find myself very tired after a long day of conversation. The accommodations here are quite nice, if a bit humble in places. Certainly, both Grimm and Aura have been very hospitable. Still, this visit has left me with more questions than answers for the time being. I've spoken privately with Charlotte, and she agrees there is something hidden in this place, something significant that we are not being told about. Perhaps with time we might gain enough trust to learn at least a few of the secrets of this place. The nearest thing we have to a plan for the moment is an offer of aid with research tomorrow. Depending on how that is received, we might be able to learn a few things. At the very least, it is clear enough to our hosts that we are here for exploration rather than profit. All I can do for now is try to get some rest and prepare for whatever comes on the morrow. There are times when one's sense of reality becomes oddly strained. One might be almost tormented by the odd sensation that something simply does not add up. Some crucial piece of the proverbial puzzle is missing, and one cannot help but feel that its discovery would fundamentally alter everything. During all of our time in this realm, I have had that slight, persistent sensation gnawing at the back of my mind, the impression that something is missing, some strange secret lying beneath the Eisenreich. This sort of thing seems to happen a lot in liminal realms, to be honest. Things often aren't exactly as they first appear. I suppose, to properly explain, I should begin with a brief overview of the day's events. After a decent rest, our group was gathered together for a simple morning meal. Little more than distilled water and nutrient paste, but I'm not inclined to complain. It is better than going hungry, I think. The conversation over the meal was far more interesting than the meal itself, of course. In fact, it soon became something of a masterclass in persuasion. I find myself wondering just how old Violet actually is, given her uncanny insights into human psychology. Without any real impression of guile, she was able to effortlessly bring the focus of the conversation to Aura's research. Then she managed to unearth the lingering doubts and frustrations about this as-yet unknown research. Apparently, the young scientist had made one or two remarkable discoveries, but since then her efforts had stalled. She couldn't make sense of the data, or so she said at least. It took only a little more nudging from Violet to persuade her that we might be able to help. A fresh set of eyes to look over this secret project. There was some hesitation, as should well be expected, but Violet brought up a key point. As we are outsiders and neither mercenary nor mercantile, we would be very unlikely to share any secrets we were brought in on. By the time the meal had concluded, Aura had decided to risk trusting us with her true research. She began by explaining the oddities that had led her to her as-yet unspecified investigations. We were brought to something like an improvised library and shown a series of very old sketches. They depicted monstrous things, accompanied by accounts of considerable ferocity. According to Aura, these were among the first accounts of human settlers in this realm, at least a couple of centuries old now. Such creatures are no longer seen, and their very existence is now doubted as a mere exaggeration, something to stir interest in prospective hunters, perhaps. As we looked over these old records, Aura explained the mistaken belief of most of the people within the Eisenreich. They believe that they are harvesting the desert's resources in these mining hunts, subduing nature, reshaping the world to their own designs, and so on. A comforting narrative, but one that she insists is incomplete at best. If this were the case, she asserted, these monstrosities would still be encountered. Indeed, they would probably become even more fierce and formidable over time, yet we find the opposite case. It was at this point that Grimm showed us a few interesting image captures. The first was of a large arachnid monstrosity. He asserted that this was one of the earliest proper photoeidetic images taken in this realm. The next image was of a decidedly less imposing creature captured by him earlier this same year. I couldn't help but notice the similarity to the slow, lumbering creature we ourselves had encountered on our way to this very outpost. Aura explained that the metal monstrosities in the depths of the desert had grown steadily more docile. It was almost as though they were being somehow domesticated. They were becoming steadily easier to capture, dismantle, and harvest. Beyond this, there was another very odd phenomenon. An especially recent appearance was a type of creature that approximated something like a hound. They would occasionally show up at remote settlements begging to be let in. Some were simply harvested, of course, but others were more or less adopted. They serve now as trackers, aiding the hunters in finding and subduing their quarry. By this time, Violet had grown quite agitated and, with rather forced politeness, asked Aura to come to the point. In answer, she explained that the only reasonable conclusion was that these creatures wanted to be harvested. They were not being exploited, but in fact were offering themselves up. Aura wondered what this could possibly accomplish, and so she began looking more closely at the fire orbs. It was at this point that she led us into the deeper levels of the outpost to show us what she had uncovered. In those secluded chambers, we saw something altogether unexpected. A fire orb filled with luminous material. Not fire, but something else, something living. Strange, formless tentacles writhed in unearthly rhythms, twisting and coiling as they brushed lightly against the glass. Aura noted, by the way, that the glass of these orbs was in fact something quite different. It was a different state of shine silver, apparently, a sort of crystallization of the normally fluid substance. She described the difference as something akin to a diamond versus graphite, both forms of carbon but arranged differently and with very distinct physical properties. She then explained how she had drawn out these fire creatures. Fire orbs are normally connected to various devices and engines and so on, providing an energy source. Aura decided to try connecting orbs back to themselves, creating a sort of positive feedback loop. The effect was described as something akin to stacking waves on top of one another, forcing underlying patterns to the surface. The result was these alien forms. A remarkable breakthrough, to be sure, but since then she'd had some difficulties. These forms appeared to be rather chaotic and almost arbitrary at times. She had made an effort in cataloging the various morphologies, but no clear pattern had emerged thus far. She stared rather wistfully into one of the orbs, and I couldn't help but risk an image capture. Grimm was thankfully pleased with the result, stating that we could keep a copy of the image for posterity so long as he was given the original. One could hardly ask for a better deal, I suppose. We were led past several other orbs, and I could see what Aura meant regarding the strange variety of the creatures. Tentacles were commonplace, but not universal. There was often a sort of resemblance to soft-bodied marine invertebrates, but this wasn't entirely consistent either. Really, the only constants were the orbs and the luminescence of whatever occupied them. This lack of any apparent pattern is what has kept her from properly publishing her research thus far. It is simply too much of an unknown at this point. If she were to publish her findings to date, and somebody else discovered some sort of pattern or explanation for the various forms, they would swiftly supplant Aura, and all of her efforts would be forgotten. Such is the world of research, and I couldn't blame her for her caution and secrecy. After a fairly exhaustive tour and some rather prolonged discussions, we retired to our quarters to sleep. As the night settled in, the outside looked rather peaceful. The fact that most windows in this place face away from the fiery section of sky no doubt helped with that. A safety precaution, as the occasional radiation storms tend to come from that direction. Charlotte and I got to talking idly, as we often do in the late hours. She told me about something from her childhood, a legend she'd been taught back in the Tulgey Wood. A creature she had never seen personally and probably didn't exist. At least she hoped it didn't exist, but that was not the point. The creature was known as a Never-Face, which I admit was something of an ominous name. It was said to lurk in the deepest, darkest portions of the forest, and it was only ever encountered by solitary travelers. Nobody knew its true face because it had a way of taking its shape from one's imagination. A traveler wandering the deep forest would hear a sudden noise alarmingly close by. They would immediately imagine what sort of creature could possibly make such a noise, and this would shape the Never-Face. Whatever the traveler imagined, that is what would emerge from the shadows. Obviously, this could be very bad. If one imagined something like a Bandersnatch or a Jabberwock, it could be altogether catastrophic. If, on the other hand, one had the sense to imagine something more like a Tove or maybe even a Momrath, it would be an altogether harmless encounter. As such, children in the Tulgey Wood were always counseled to practice imagining the most harmless, friendly creatures they could think of, just in case they ever happened across the Neverface. Charlotte wasn't sure why the story had come to mind, but I had a few suspicions. As I began to fall asleep, a plan was already taking shape. It has been a productive morning thus far, or so I hope at least. After last night's conversation, I recalled something a mentor once warned me about. One very important thing about scientific study is accounting for variables. If you want to accurately predict a phenomenon, you must first accurately explain its causes. Any number of hidden variables might affect outcomes, so one must account for as many of these variables as possible. Some of the most pernicious and elusive variables emanate from the scientists themselves. There is inevitably a human factor that must be taken into consideration. So, this morning I have endeavored to alter this factor and see what happens. I spoke with Violet and made a modest research proposal. Though I am suspicious of her motives, there is no denying her talents. She has considerable mental discipline and a very strong will. This makes her alarmingly persuasive at times, but it is also perfect for today's little experiment. With Ara's permission, Violet has taken charge of one of the awakened fire orbs. The creature within responds to her proximity in a most uncanny fashion even now. She has started to meditate over the device. If my suspicions are correct, we will probably see results before the next sunset. My suspicions have been confirmed, at least to some degree, and Ara's world has been turned upside down in the process. This may take a bit of explanation, so let me begin by describing what happened. As Violet exerted her will over the fire orb, the creature within slowly began to shift. Its form flowed and twisted, flaring with eldritch energies as a purplish hue suffused the orb. After perhaps half an hour of sustained, focused effort, something unexpected had taken shape. It had a vaguely human form, though a fairy or pixie might be a more accurate description. Still a creature of living fire, but shaped now into something more similar to ourselves. One might reasonably ask just how this happened. I suppose it all came down to expectation. The creatures within the orbs seemed chaotic in their various forms, but there was an underlying pattern after all. That pattern was Aura herself. As she interacted with the orbs, as she touched the conduits while looping them back upon themselves, she was always thinking of what might take shape. There was always a vague, unspoken, largely unconscious expectation. The expectation of some sort of invertebrate creature, as it turned out. Violet's meditation guided the orb's occupant into a different shape. She focused on thoughts of fey creatures, which she has extensively studied in Scrimshaw's library. Enough so that she had very clear images in mind. A proper human shape would have been too much of a reach, so she claimed, but the Fae are mercurial enough to allow for more fluid imagery and accommodating forms. While this was remarkable enough in itself, what happened next was altogether unexpected. It would seem the creature took on certain mental morphologies along with its new physical form, as we all began to hear it speaking softly in our minds. Thus began a very strange conversation. The voice, if it could be called a voice, spoke largely in images and abstract concepts at first. As time passed, more words began to take shape among these impressions. It was as if the creature was learning the very concept of language for the first time. If so, it has proved to be an alarmingly quick study. What follows is my approximate summary of the account the creature gave, a sort of explanation of its own existence and perspectives. The distant fire in the sky over the deep desert is, among other things, a vast field of energy. It is also a living thing of sorts, a chaotic consciousness, too frenzied to hold on to coherent thoughts for any real length of time. I couldn't help but remember certain legends of so-called blind idiot gods, mindless deities of incalculable power and altogether random thought patterns. This thing, this mind, this energy was able to instinctively bud pieces off of itself, wrapping them in bubbles of crystallized shine silver to form the fire orbs. It instinctively sculpted metal bodies, allowing these fragments to traverse the strange realm beyond its own eternal fire. At first, these strangely embodied creatures explored the empty desert. Indeed, they were exploring the very concept of a corporeal existence. Then humans entered the realm, and things became infinitely more interesting. It was strange to be hunted down, so the creature told us. A new and fascinating sensation having the metal bodies taken apart. Even more intriguing, finding these orbs carried far away from their parental fire, connected to new, unknown devices. The humans made no sense to these creatures, but they were still fascinating to observe. The regular drawing off of excess energy allowed the thoughts of these captured fragments to calm themselves. Chaotic, random thought processes became slower and more ordered, more focused. They began to reach out through the living metal that surrounded them. Without quite realizing it, they began to subtly bend the humans. Strange dreams, sudden flashes of inspiration, moments of insight, and the city of Eisenstadt grew in new directions. Yet always there was the gulf. These consciousnesses could not understand human patterns of thought, or even existence. After all, humans were altogether absurd and preposterous creatures. No fire and hardly any metal, just organic macromolecules suspended in water and salt, wrapped up in lipids animated by ions flowing this way and that. Much too strange to understand, too alien, too different. At least until now. Our meddling has created a bridge. A thin, tenuous bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. The orbs within this outpost can speak to humanity directly now. Naturally, both sides have quite a lot of questions for one another. It is later now, almost dark outside, and it has been a very long and busy day. Here is the shape of things, so far as I can understand it. The orb creatures, which Aura has started referring to as flame sprites, apparently do not see their harvesting and usage by humans as any sort of confinement or enslavement. There is no resentment, which is fortunate, all things considered. Apparently, these beings are still connected to their parent consciousness, the endless chaos in the distant sky. They could leave their orbs empty at any time. One of the creatures went so far as to demonstrate, vanishing for just a few seconds. When it returned, its form was strangely blurred and its motions were quite agitated for some time. Yet as it calmed, it explained that returning was a relief. These creatures have tasted the calm of focused consciousness, and they have no desire to return to the mindless chaos of their parent entity. Indeed, the constant tapping of their boundless energies is a genuine relief to them. It seems that, rather than exploitation, the human use of fire orbs in this realm is more of a symbiosis. Neither Aura nor her flame sprites are inclined to endanger this symbiosis, so both sides have reached something of an agreement. For now, at least, her research remains unpublished, and the creatures only take on proper forms within this outpost. Elsewhere, they shall retain the appearance of formless fire, leaving the public unaware of their sapience. Still, I wonder how long this will persist. The bridge we've unwittingly made here, it will inevitably have repercussions. These fire creatures understand human language now, and if they are all connected, then every fire orb in the realm is likely to perceive humans far more clearly moving forward. I am certain that change is coming, but I have no idea just what that change might look like. Alas, poor Herbert. He's exhausted himself with mulling over the implications of recent events, leaving yours truly to tidy up. Yes, it is the indefatigable Scrimshaw once more, come to settle accounts and finish this particular tale. Truly, though, there isn't all that much left to tell. To begin with, Miss Aura and Mr. Grimm are both quite overwhelmed and delighted with recent events. I suppose they're both still rather young and naive that way. Still a charming couple. They asked us to stay, offered us a place, Violet in particular. I'd have thought she might accept, given her worrying enthusiasm for this entire voyage, but she has taken us all by surprise. Her interest in the Eisenreich has sharply waned. At first, I wondered if it might be a matter of losing interest after solving a mystery. It was quite some time later before I was able to get a proper explanation from her. Despite the warm welcomes and generous offers by our hosts, all four of us felt it was time we were leaving. Indeed, Herbert seemed quite desperate to depart before encountering any fallout of what he worries might be a colossal blunder on his part. Personally, I believe he's being a bit too hard on himself, and perhaps a tad arrogant in his humble way. I think this contact was inevitable sooner or later, the way Aura's been poking at these orbs with such focused interest. Sooner or later, she was bound to dream of making some sort of meaningful contact with the things. At least this way, they took on a friendly Fae persona, courtesy of a bit of whimsical guidance on Violet's part. The journey back has been something of a blur, and there isn't all that much to tell, really. Young Miss Abigail was kind enough to see us back to Port Nowhere, and received what she considered to be a generous payment in medical supplies. From there, we passed through a number of outposts in search of the cheapest route back to Eisenstadt. After all, our funds are not infinite, and we might as well see a few extra locales on our way home. Herbert's medicines have carried us through this realm in fine form, I should note. He's had to spend most of his supplies to get us where we needed to go, but there is still a bit left over, enough to trade for some ingots of precious metals. So, in the end, we've even turned a profit with this little adventure. I should note here, these ingots have been specially marked, as are all metal supplies destined to leave the Eisenreich. Anything destined for mundane reality is drained of all of its shine silver by processes that nobody is all that clear about, trade secrets and all that. Apparently, if any metal alloyed with the stuff were to enter mundane reality, the shine silver would dissolve away, leaving a brittle, useless form of metal tainted with traces of radioactive waste material. Not the most comforting thought. I suppose I should also mention that Herbert kept his word to that noble chap, Lord Wembley I think he was called. Anyway, the fellow with the greenhouses. We spent our final night in Eisenstadt in fine accommodations, and were sent off the next morning with an additional payment of precious metal ingots. Quite cheap here, but of considerable value back home, an ideal gift for travelers like ourselves. It is a relief to be back at the old manor, for all its creaking floorboards and restless ghosts. Herbert and Charlotte stayed overnight when we returned, out of exhaustion as much as anything else. Still, it did give us all time enough to debrief a little and take stock of this latest adventure. Charlotte seems quite pleased, and has settled into the calm, satisfied mood she takes on after every liminal voyage. I hope it'll last a good little while for Herbert's sake. Poor fellow worries too much. Can't say that I blame him. As for Violet, she is already back in the library, looking up new places to travel to. Just as well, in all likelihood. None of us four are the sort that do well just sitting around for too long. Still, I am not without my concerns on the matter. After Herbert and Charlotte had gone, I took the opportunity to speak with Violet. She was somewhat dismissive at first, looking quite enamored with whatever new book she'd found. Still, she found her manners after I brought a bit of tea and a few of those little pastries she's developed a fondness for. With her rendered a bit more amicable, for a time, I was able to ask more plainly about her sudden lack of interest in the Eisenreich. For almost the entire journey, she had been the most driven out of all of us. Everything to do with the deep desert, the metal creatures, the fire orbs, it was almost like a drug to her. She pursued knowledge of such things with a feverish intensity, which I think Herbert purposefully underplayed in his own account. Then, at the end, with such remarkable discoveries before us, her interest suddenly ebbed away. Indeed, it faded into nothing almost before my eyes. I could not help but wonder why, and when I put it to her in such terms, she immediately understood my puzzlement. So, when I asked just what had made her so indifferent so suddenly, she briefly explained that a chaotic, frenzied mind held no interest for her. The little orb creatures were charming enough, but they were distinct entities despite their interconnections. Finite creatures, she called them, no deeper than human minds. She is hoping to find something more interesting on our next venture, but in order to do that, she would have to do more research. With that, she returned to her book and politely asked to be left to focus. With my questions more or less duly answered, I had little cause to trouble her further. Still, it is times like these when I can feel the age her youthful visage hides. I've done a little research of my own without her knowledge, and I've found some things out that are especially interesting. But that is another matter best explored another time. For the moment, I'll close this account. If Herbert wishes to add anything, I am certain he'll be able to write whatever conclusion he feels is appropriate. This account does feel incomplete without at least a small conclusion on my part. Scrimshaw's a decent fellow, for all his bluster. Far better than I thought he was when we first met. Since returning home, Charlotte and I have spoken together a good deal. We've looked back over this particular voyage into the realm of iron, the Eisenreich, which was undertaken largely at Violet's request. Granted, it has been profitable for all of us in the end, on at least a few levels, but I am still concerned. When we met Violet beneath the Amber Desert, she asked to accompany us as she had been exiled from her order. So she said, at least, but I wonder just how true that actually was. This secretive order are servants to the thing that dwells far below that desert, the conscious dimension that connects to the other end of that liminal realm. The one below all, they call it, an entity that has guided the evolution of the eldritch things that dwell in those deep caverns. A creature that might easily be thought of as a deity of sorts, an outer god, perhaps. I believe I know what Violet was looking for traveling into the Eisenreich. What she is searching for even now as she sifts through Scrimshaw's esoteric library. I believe she is seeking another outer god. For what purpose I cannot say, and I am reluctant to even speculate. At the very least, the chaotic flame of the deep desert did not suit her purposes. If I had any sense, I would decline any future requests for travel, but that won't work. Charlotte tends to go mad when she's away from liminal realms for too long. I myself seem to be no good at prolonged life in this reality either, when it comes down to it. Beyond that, Violet can be remarkably persuasive. So for now, we wait to see where we might travel to next. We wait to see if there might be other gods out there, lurking at the far edges of the liminal realms. We wait to discover just what Violet might do if she finds one.